Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are going to be talking about 3 commonly tested excuses for non-performance of a contract: impossibility, impracticability, and frustration of purpose. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess, that's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Today, we are going to be talking about 3 commonly tested excuses for non-performance of a contract: impossibility, impracticability, and frustration of purpose. Unlike defenses to formation such as mistake or unconscionability, a party asserting an excuse is not claiming that they are not contractually obligated to perform. Rather, they are claiming that their contractual obligations should be discharged as a result of supervening events that occurred after the formation of a contract. So let's review the rules for these excuses, starting with impossibility. Performance is discharged when it is objectively impossible to perform a contract because of 1. Death or physical incapacity of the person necessary to effectuate the contract. 2. Unanticipated destruction of the subject matter necessary to fulfill the contract. Or 3. A new law or regulation that was unanticipated makes performance extremely and unreasonably difficult or expensive. To illustrate, let's look at the landmark 1863 English case of Taylor versus Caldwell. As you may recall, in Taylor, the plaintiffs contracted with the defendants to use a music hall for concerts and other events over the course of 4 days. A week before the first concert, through no fault of either party, the hall was destroyed by fire. The court held that because the fire was not the fault of either party, and the destruction of the hall rendered it impossible for the plaintiffs to utilize the venue as intended, the parties were excused from performing their respective duties. Okay, let's move on to impracticability. Performance is discharged as impracticable when 1. An event occurs after contract formation, 2. That is unanticipated by both parties at contract formation, 3. Making performance extremely and unreasonably difficult or expensive. This doctrine is interpreted narrowly by the courts. Generally, an increased cost to perform a contractual obligation is not sufficient to render the contract excused due to impracticability. In the words of the restatement, a mere change in the degree of difficulty or expense due to such causes as increased wages, prices of raw materials, or costs of construction, unless well beyond the normal range, does not amount to impracticability, since it is this sort of risk that a fixed-price contract is intended to cover. The case law on this issue, while not always consistent, makes clear that mere increased cost, lack of profitability, or even financial loss does not by itself rise to the level of impracticability. For example, in the government contracting context, courts have held that increases in costs of 57% and 70% did not by themselves constitute commercial impracticability. In contrast, courts have found performance to be impracticable when compliance with the contract would entail an extreme increase in cost coupled with an extreme increase in the difficulty of performance. For example, in one case, performance was held to be impracticable, where it would have taken more than 8 times longer and cost more than 20 times more than originally anticipated. In another case, performance was held impracticable, where it would have taken almost 7 times longer and about 150% more than anticipated. You likely did not cover these cases in law school, and you don't need to be familiar with them to analyze an impracticability case. The important thing is that you understand that, generally speaking, performance is not impracticable merely because a party will have to spend more money. Before we move on, it's worth quickly noting that the terminology here is not always consistent. For example, the restatement substitutes impossibility with impracticability. In other words, under the restatement view, physical impossibility is considered a type of impracticability. And that might be the way you learned it in law school. If that's the case, you should write your rule statements accordingly. But for the purpose of our discussion today, we will be treating impossibility and impracticability as separate concepts. You should also treat them as separate concepts on the bar exam. Okay, now that we've cleared that up, let's move on to frustration of purpose. The frustration of purpose doctrine discharges performance under a contract if the purpose of the contract no longer exists. Performance is excused if 1. A party's principal purpose is substantially frustrated without his fault, 2. By an unforeseeable supervening event outside the party's control, and 3. Both parties knew the purpose at the time of formation. To illustrate, let's go back to England for the case of Krell versus Henry. You may recall Henry entered into an agreement with Krell to use Krell's flat for 2 days to watch the king's coronation. Henry approached Krell about the flat in response to a flyer hanging in Krell's window announcing the availability of the flat for rent to see the coronation. The written agreement, however, did not mention the coronation or any other purpose for the rental. When the king became ill, the coronation was canceled, and Henry refused to pay for the flat. The court held that Henry's performance was excused because the contract was implicitly founded on the assumption that the coronation would take place. In other words, without the coronation taking place, the contract was essentially valueless to Henry. It's important to note that frustration of purpose is a very narrow excuse that is invoked successfully even less frequently than impracticability. As with impracticability, frustration of purpose cannot be invoked merely because a contract is no longer profitable. Let's move on to our first hypo. This one is adapted from the February 2009 California Bar Exam. Developer had an option to purchase a 5-acre parcel named The Highlands in city from owner and was planning to build a residential development there. Developer could not proceed with the project until city approved the extension of utilities to the Highlands parcel. In order to encourage development, city had a well-known and long-standing policy of reimbursing developers for their cost of installing utilities in new areas. Developer signed a contract with builder for the construction of 10 single-family homes on the Highlands parcel. During pre-contract negotiations, developer specifically informed builder that he could not proceed with the project unless city followed its usual policy of reimbursing the developer for the installation of utilities, and builder acknowledged that he understood such a condition to be implicit in the contract. In a change of policy, city approved necessary utility extensions to the Highlands parcel, but only on the condition that developer bear the entire cost, which was substantial, without reimbursement by city. Because this additional cost made the project unprofitable, developer abandoned plans for the development and did not exercise his option to purchase the Highlands parcel from owner. Builder, claiming breach of contract, sued developer for the profit he would have made on the project. Was developer's performance excused? All right, you probably noticed that there are a few different issues here, but we're just going to be focusing on our 3 excuses. Let's start with impossibility. It's clear that the first 2 types of impossibility don't apply because neither party died or was incapacitated, nor was there any destruction of the subject matter necessary to fulfill the contract. The third type might apply, however. We're told that city had a well-known and long-standing policy of reimbursing developers for the cost of installing utilities in new areas. We're then told that in a change of policy, city approved the utility extensions, but without reimbursing the developer, thereby rendering the project unprofitable to developer. Based on these facts, developer would argue that city's change in policy was an unanticipated new law or regulation that made his performance extremely and unreasonably expensive. But there are 2 problems with this argument. First, it's not entirely clear that the change in policy constitutes a new law or regulation. For one thing, it's not clear that the policy itself is a law or regulation rather than the city's historical approach when considering applications for utility extensions. It's also not clear whether the change in policy was a universal change rather than a deviation from their usual approach when considering this specific application. In any case, even if the change in policy does constitute an unanticipated new law, it's highly unlikely that the added expense to developer would be considered extreme or unreasonable. After all, it's not even clear that developer would lose any money on this project. All we know is that he wouldn't make a profit. While the change in policy definitely makes this a worse deal for developer, it doesn't render his performance impossible. But remember, it can still be impractical. Okay, that covers impossibility. So let's move forward onto impracticability. The first element requires an event that occurs after contract formation. That's satisfied because city's policy changed after developer and builder had already entered into the contract. The second element requires that the event be unanticipated by both parties at contract formation. That's also satisfied because we're told the developer specifically informed builder that he could not proceed with the project unless city followed its usual policy of reimbursing the developer for the installation of utilities. And builder acknowledged that he understood such a condition to be implicit in the contract. The third element requires that the event made performance extremely and unreasonably difficult or expensive. Developer would argue that this element is satisfied because he would no longer make any profit on the contract. While we don't have all of the facts here, including the amount of anticipated profit relative to the total value of the contract, it's unlikely that developer's argument will succeed. While the facts state that the increased cost is substantial, there is no indication that it is beyond the normal range, as required by the restatement. Moreover, aside from the increased cost to developer, there is no indication that developer's performance would be any more burdensome. Accordingly, developer's performance would likely not be considered extremely and unreasonably difficult or expensive. Now we just have to address frustration of purpose. We know that city's change of policy was unforeseeable and out of the party's control, which satisfies the second element. The real issue here is whether developer's principal purpose was substantially frustrated. Developer would argue that his principal purpose was to make a profit on the contract. In other words, he would not have entered into the contract with builder if he could not make a profit on the development. While it's likely true, the same is also true of almost every party that enters into a commercial contract. And the doctrine of frustration of purpose is not meant to protect against a loss of profit. Accordingly, builder will successfully argue that the purpose of the contract was not to make a specified profit, but rather to develop a residential community. City's change in policy did not frustrate that purpose. Builder can still build the homes, and developer can still sell the homes. While the contract is undoubtedly less valuable to developer now that he cannot make a profit, it is not essentially valueless. Thus, the purpose of the contract was not substantially frustrated. All right, let's do one more hypo to make sure we really understand these rules. This one is adapted from the July 2006 California Bar Exam. On Monday, ResiClean advertised its house cleaning services by hanging paper advertisements on doorknobs in residential areas. Maria, a homeowner, responded to the advertisement, phoned RC on the same day, spoke to a manager, and said she wanted a top-to-bottom house cleaning as described in the advertisement. Within minutes after the phone conversation ended, the RC manager deposited in the mail a confirmation of order form to Maria. The form stated, "We hereby confirm your top-to-bottom house cleaning for $500. Our crew will arrive at your house before noon on Friday." About an hour later, Maria sent ResiClean an email, which RC received, stating, "I just want to explain that it's important that your cleaning crew do a good job because my house is up for sale and I want it to look exceptionally good." On Thursday evening, before RC's cleaning crew was to show up, Maria accepted an offer for the sale of her house. The next morning, Friday at 10 a.m., Maria sent RC another email stating, "No need to send your crew. I sold my house last night and I no longer need your services." By that time, however, RC's crew was en route to Maria's house. When RC billed, Maria refused to pay. Is Maria's performance excused? All right, as with our first hypo, let's start by addressing impossibility. What other types of impossibility exist here? There is no death or incapacity, no destruction of the subject matter of the contract, and no change in a law or regulation. Maria might not want the cleaning anymore, but ResiClean could still clean Maria's house, and Maria could still pay ResiClean for their services. Therefore, Maria's performance is not excused on impossibility grounds. What about impracticability? We're told that the sale of Maria's house occurred after she and ResiClean entered into a contract, so the first element is satisfied. There is no indication, however, that the sale of the house was unanticipated at contract formation. In other words, the non-occurrence of the sale was not a basic assumption of the contract. While Maria later informed ResiClean that her house was up for sale, all ResiClean knew at the time of the contract formation was that she wanted a top-to-bottom cleaning. Moreover, the fact that Maria no longer wants the cleaning does not render her performance extremely or unreasonably difficult or expensive. Maria would still pay the exact same amount for the cleaning, and ResiClean would provide exactly the same service that it agreed to provide. Therefore, Maria's performance is also not excused on impracticability grounds. What about frustration of purpose? Maria will argue that the purpose of the contract was to have a clean house for prospective buyers. When Maria sold the house, that purpose was frustrated. ResiClean will successfully argue, however, that the sale of the house was foreseeable and entirely within Maria's control. However, at the time ResiClean entered into the contract, it had no idea that Maria was selling her house. Therefore, Maria's performance is also not excused on frustration of purpose grounds. And with that, we're done with today's hypos. At this point, you might be asking yourself what it would take for one of these exceptions to succeed. And the answer is quite a bit. Impossibility, impracticability, and frustration of purpose are meant to excuse performance only in the most extreme or unusual circumstances. As you saw today, just because performance becomes much harder or more expensive doesn't mean it is excused. So be careful when discussing these excuses, and if in doubt, err on the side of concluding that they will not succeed. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.